The following story was inspired by something that philosopher Roger Scruton said. Scruton claimed, "Nobody would object if you build Bath again in the middle of the countryside." Scruton's idea was that people wouldn't mind green fields being built on if what was built was beautiful, and that set me thinking, is this really true? The first I ever heard of the fungus was in a news article about a tower block in London. Small fungal caps had appeared on an outside wall stretching all the way from the ground to the top, 20 blocks up. As is widely known among anyone who takes an interest in fungus, the cap is merely the fruiting body of a much larger structure. Its purpose is only to spend a few short days or weeks distributing spores. The main body of the fungus is a mycelial network resembling thin white threads that colonize the fungus's food stock, in this case, concrete. It was quickly determined that the fungus was of a previously unknown type and was able to colonize concrete via an ingenious strategy involving a superficial mycelial layer transporting water bit by bit deep into the material. I remember discussing the article with my wife Jill over lunch. "They're saying it might have been manufactured in a laboratory somewhere," I said. "Maybe by some relatively backwards nation that happens to hate us." "If it only eats tower blocks, it'll be doing us a favour," Jill replied. We laughed. "I certainly wouldn't mind seeing less concrete," I said. "Could it eat the stuff that holds the bricks of our house together?" said Jill thoughtfully. "I suppose it could," I said. "I think concrete is just cement with other stuff added. I wonder if our foundations aren't concrete, come to think of it." "What about roads?" said Jill. "No, they're made of something else. Tarmac, maybe? I think it's made from oil somehow." "Pavements, though," said Jill. "They look like concrete, you know, the curbs." "True," I said. We digested these ideas silently for a while, chewing on our pasta. "Let's hope they get it under control then," Jill said, finally. In truth, our understanding of the material basis of the world around us was lamentable. I was an electrical engineer and my wife an artist. Neither of us had any real understanding of the sheer extent to which concrete had pervaded our world. Over the following days, the news was full of articles about efforts to control the fungus, determine the extent of its spread and its origin, and possible methods for preventing it spreading further. 2 more tower blocks were discovered to be infected. They both had to be evacuated. The mycelial network had already colonized large sections of the blocks by the time the caps appeared. The buildings were sprayed with fungicide, demolished, and the rubble taken away to be incinerated. The spores were found in air samples taken the world over. Frantic efforts were then made to check other buildings for the presence of the mycelia, and over 1,000 infected buildings were discovered. They all had to be demolished and burned. This sparked huge protests. It hadn't escaped people's attention that the wealthy seldom live in buildings made of concrete. Poorer people were vastly disproportionately affected. Many of the residents of the demolished blocks felt that treating the buildings with fungicide ought to have been enough. Some refused to leave and had to be hauled out by the police. Vast protests ensued, which turned into riots. There was a certain smugness among the middle class in certain quarters. The tower blocks had always been resented for their ugliness. Then traces of mycelia were found in the cement and foundations of suburban residential homes, and that split opinion further and provoked ferocious arguments. Some people thought only old houses would be affected, while others thought only new houses would be affected. Some treated their houses with fungicide, while others dismissed the risks and complained of the effects on health of the fungicides, none of which were thought to be very effective against the organism we now call cement fungus anyway. Some resorted to coating their houses in a thin polymer varnish, but this led to terrible problems with humidity, and some said, only increased susceptibility to the fungus. For a while I was inclined to regard the whole thing as a bit of a storm in a teacup, something the media had seized hold of to sell more papers and get more clicks on their websites. The seriousness of the matter was brought home to me one day when I happened to drive along a road with concrete lampposts, and I saw that every single one of them, for several miles, was lined with fungus caps all the way up. I stopped in a lay-by to examine the fungus more closely. The caps were small and white, each about the size of a pound coin, and they seldom grew bigger. Underneath was a delicate gill structure with a faint bluish tinge. They exuded an unmistakable odour, rather fungal, but with overtones of anise. It was inevitable that at some point someone would ask whether the fungus might not be edible. No one knew exactly who discovered the effects of the fungus, and probably numerous people discovered them around the same time. Rumours had been circulating long before the journalists reported on them. It appeared that when eaten, the fungus had a stimulating effect upon the human organism. There was a substance in it which caused birds and most other animals to avoid them, but in small doses, 2 or 3 caps, it produced a strong sense of vigour and strength. Scientists cautioned people against eating the caps, pointing out that it was impossible to know the long-term effects of a substance that, until a matter of months earlier, was unknown to science. But that didn't stop people. Who doesn't want more energy? A man was found who claimed to be a resident of the very first tower block to become infected, and who further claimed to have discovered the effects of the fungi himself. In his case, the vigour had given way, after about 3 months, to fatigue and apathy. Of course, it was impossible to verify his claims, and perhaps he might have become apathetic anyway. He was a prolific user of drugs of all kinds, and hardly a reliable source. It's impossible to say what societal effects the fungus created psychopharmacologically, but I believe such effects played a significant part in what happened. The fungus created problems, dispossessing people of their houses and jobs, and it offered a sort of fix, or an illusion of a fix, via its action on the brain when eaten. Under the influence of the fungus, people tended to rush about, clinging to one absurd notion after another, where instead sober reflection was needed. As the fungus's relentless march continued, the towns began to crumble and become pathologically corrupt. Many roads too became unusable and littered with decaying blocks of concrete. Houses collapsed in the suburbs as the fungus ate away foundations and cement. The only people who weren't directly affected were people living in old stone houses, most often in isolated villages. Many people were crushed in horrific collapses as buildings fell apart around them, and a not insignificant number of people were killed in bridge collapses. Vast improvised villages of tents and wooden shacks were built to house the refugees, and the UK teetered on the brink of revolution. The pattern was repeated across Europe and much of the rest of the world. In Rome, there were great fears over the Colosseum. It was built using a kind of durable Roman concrete, but it turned out the fungus had no taste for Roman concrete. Modern concrete was what it had a taste for. Jill and I waited anxiously to see whether, or more likely when, our own house would fall apart. It was into this unstable and volatile situation that the stable architecture movement arose, led by the charismatic Adam Briggs. Briggs had friends in powerful places. He had obtained permission to build on greenbelt land on which new builds had been explicitly forbidden to avoid cities joining up into horrible megastructures. On certain conditions, namely, Briggs was going to build a new city, but not just any city. He was going to build the most beautiful city that had ever existed in the UK, with inspiration taken from the finer parts of Bath and Edinburgh, along with strong hints of beautiful stone villages from the Cotswolds, the Lake District and the Peak District. Its centrepiece was to be a vast cathedral, somewhat modelled on York Minster, but with an enormous dome like the Santa Maria del Fiore of Florence. As for affordable housing, there would be none. Since all the buildings were to be constructed only of stone, only the wealthy would be able to afford to live there. Given the situation with thousands of newly homeless individuals, that attracted enormous controversy, even to the extent of provoking further riots. How could the government, people asked, justify the building of a vast city of wealth and opulence, at a time when so many were living in hastily erected wooden shacks and even tents? Briggs countered that no public money would be spent on the city. It would be funded only by wealthy patrons, but people were still deeply unhappy that previously undeveloped land was to be used for the project. Inevitably, our house became infected. The fungus began to corrode the cement between the bricks and the foundations, and the inspectors declared our house unsafe. We purchased a large tent which we erected in the garden along with 2 smaller tents as bathrooms and moved into that. My wife cried bitterly, but I implored her to see it as an adventure of temporary duration. Any houses constructed without cement were by then selling at vastly inflated prices, which we could simply not afford. We were fortunate that it was summer, but there was little hope that we would find better accommodation by winter. Then, one evening, when we were sitting miserably in our sleeping bags reading, we heard an unfamiliar voice coming from close by. "Roy Burns? Jill Burns?" "Probably another inspector," said my wife. "They're going to tell us our tents aren't safe next." "We're here," I said, and I got wearily up out of my bag and off the cold ground and unzipped the tent. "I'm sorry to disturb you," he said. "You are Roy Burns, the electrical engineer?" "The very same," I said dryly. "I'm Adam Briggs," he said. "I should very much like to talk to you. I tried to phone, but most of the towers have collapsed, as you know, and there doesn't seem to be a signal round here." "There isn't anymore," I replied. "But are you the Adam Briggs?" "I most certainly am," he said jauntily, "and I'm here to offer you a job, both of you." He was a shortish, somewhat round man, with an angled but full face, exuding goodwill and rich living. We invited him in, and he gamely sat himself on a mat next to our sleeping bags and wrapped himself in a blanket. I set some water on a little camping stove in the entrance so I could make coffee. "You've heard of our little project, of course," he said. "You see, we want to make a clean break with the past. Britain has become filled with the most repulsive architecture. I'm not just talking about the big, grand buildings, but also the endless, identical, featureless houses. And we're going to change that. We want to build a city that future generations will be proud of. A city that uplifts the soul. A city where one can awaken every morning and feel like one is on holiday simply due to the sheer beauty of the place. We want to build a city that puts joy and hope into people's souls instead of dragging them down." "That's quite a speech," I said. "What do you want with us?" Perhaps my words seemed rude, but we had after all recently lost our house and had spent the 2 weeks since then living in a tent in our small garden. On top of that, it's not unreasonable to state that the media had demonised Briggs, so that meeting him felt not unlike meeting the leader of some extreme radical political party. "I've acquainted myself with your past work, both of you," he said. "I want you to come and live in Sentenza and help us construct it." "Sentenza?" said Jill. "That's the working name we're giving to our new city," said Briggs. "But we're open to suggestions. It will be one of the most beautiful towns in the whole of the world, and we will not use a drop of concrete or cement in its construction. I believe that, utilising the most modern machinery, in a space of 10 years we can construct a city that even a Greek god would be proud of. We've already constructed a number of stone cottages for workers, and there's one with your name on it. Your positions will come with substantial pay packets, naturally. I don't think you'll be disappointed." Jill and I exchanged glances. We were living in a tent. This was no time for nuanced discussions of ethics. "We'd be delighted to assist," I said. We moved into a beautiful, if somewhat rustic, cottage on what would eventually be the edge of town, and over the next year we worked tirelessly on the new city. I arranging electrical supply to the new buildings, and Jill arranging statues and decoration. The city took shape at a remarkable pace. Briggs had all the latest machines, utilising cutting-edge technology and a vast, highly skilled workforce, alongside many other less skilled workers of all kinds. But all this took place against a background of escalating protests. A certain type of person took our work as a personal insult or an attack against the poor and the homeless, of which there were now very many. One morning in early March, I left the house to go to work and I noticed a fence was being erected around the edge of town. I cornered one of the supervisors in charge of it. "What's the fence for?" I asked. "It's the only way to stop the sabotage," he replied. 3 people have been assaulted in the past week by these vermin, and one of them set fire to a house over on the west side. We're building a fence around the entire town. Isn't it going to end up resembling a ghetto? It's only going to be temporary, he said. Once we've finished the work, the protests will die down and the fence will be removed. I allowed my gaze to stray to the fields beyond the fence, the daily occurrences in which I had learned to studiously ignore. A crowd of people had assembled there and they were waving placards that said things like, "House the homeless, not the rich," and "Capitalism is violence." A man was standing at the front gesticulating at the fence and shouting something. If inciting violence against fences were to be made a crime, he looked like he would definitely be guilty of it. "The worst of them always come at night," said the supervisor grimly. That day I went to work with a sense of foreboding. Our house was awfully close to the fence. "I don't understand why these people have a problem with us," I said to Jill that evening. "Don't they see that the project provides jobs for more than 2,000 workers? Do they think we are all rich? They think the money should be spent on rehousing people," she said. "But isn't that what got us into the whole mess in the first place?" I said. "We built millions of cheap houses and they all crumbled. And anyway, it's not public money." "A lot of them are communists," said Jill. "They believe all money should be public money. Some of them don't even believe that money should exist at all. They think the government should force us to build shacks for the homeless." As it turned out, the fence wasn't effective at stopping the protesters. 2 more houses were firebombed over the next month. They survived due to being constructed largely of stone, but the insides of one of them was completely destroyed and had to be rebuilt. A second fence was built inside the first fence, and guard towers were erected to monitor the corridor between the 2 fences, equipped with searchlights and water cannons. It became impossible to leave the city without encountering a large angry crowd, which the police could never seem to disperse. Perhaps they didn't want to. Many in the police sided with the protesters. Truly, we were prisoners. 6 months later, we finished erecting the vast dome above the cathedral. A vast amount of work still had to be completed on the furnishings and internal and external ornamentation of the structure, but the outlines of the building were all in place. It was unclear to what god the cathedral was dedicated. There weren't many serious Christians among us, and what few there were divided into a plethora of different denominations, with the largest single group being Catholics, but that amounted to only a few dozen people. Neither did we have any way of anticipating the religious inclinations of the people who would eventually inhabit the city. It was provisionally decided that the cathedral stood as a monument to truth and beauty, and anyone who wanted to personify truth and beauty as God was free to do so. Our beautiful city was taking shape, and truly it gladdened the heart and uplifted the soul to see it. Yet at the same time, we were painfully aware that we now lived in a gilded cage, surrounded by the malign forces of chaos and destruction. Scarcely had the dome been set in place when the first of the missiles landed on a beautiful 3-story townhouse in a mock Tudor style next to the market square. It was of primitive construction, hardly more than a large firework, but it carried an effective payload that destroyed half of the roof and the upper floor of the house. It's fortunate that the house was empty. The ongoing situation with the protests had made it difficult to sell or rent out the houses, and many completed buildings stood empty. The following day, Briggs gathered us in the empty market square and gave a speech. I don't remember it in detail, but it went something along the following lines. "My friends, we are under attack by people who are spurred to violence by spite and jealousy. What we are doing here subtracts from no one and adds to Europe a monument to beauty that will stand long after we and our children and our children's children have passed away. Jesus told his followers to give to the poor, but he also said, "The poor will always be with you." I am not myself a Christian, but I believe he intended to point out that if we always devote ourselves only to present problems, we can achieve nothing of lasting value. Without a transcendent eye on posterity, without willingness to sacrifice present exigencies for the sake of the future, there could have been no moon landing, no Venice, no St. Paul's. We would live as animals, grovelling in the mud, unable to free ourselves from even... At that moment his speech was interrupted by a bomb dropped from a drone directly into our midst. There was an ear-splitting bang, followed by terrible screams. I saw a severed leg flying through the air, and a black pall of acrid smoke arose and formed itself into a mushroom-shaped cloud. 6 people had been killed by the explosion, and another 7 seriously injured. All of them workers employed to construct the city. Another 2 people received serious injuries in the mad stampede that followed, as people rushed to find cover in case more bombs followed. The news media published articles faintly condemning the bombings, arguing that the root cause of them was systemic inequality, and in short, that we could expect nothing else if we refused to allow the poverty-stricken protesters inside our fortified compound to share equally in the riches we had gathered inside. Jill and I went to look at the massed crowds outside the fence from a safe distance. There were more of them than ever before, and they seemed, if anything, even angrier than previously. The water cannons were being turned on them regularly. By then, it had been firmly established that prolonged consumption of the mushrooms produced a definite syndrome with a clear trajectory. Initial vigour was followed after some months by apathy and dysphoria, and the symptoms were the same for more or less everyone. In the apathetic stage, dark circles developed under the eyes, and the eyes themselves took on a glassy and watery appearance. We could quite clearly see the effects of fungus consumption on the faces of many of the crowd of protesters, yet their apathy had not translated into them remaining in their tents and hovels. Rather, they found it convenient to mass outside our town. Others among them appeared to be in the early vigorous stages of fungus intoxication, although it was impossible to separate those from the ones who were simply fired up by what they perceived as the righteousness of their cause. The following weeks brought only further horror. Even as anti-missile systems were being installed to combat the growing threat of aerial bombardment, our own cottage was slightly damaged by a primitive grenade fired from a launcher, and we moved into a townhouse closer to the city centre, from the upper floor of which we had a fine view of the cathedral. Then a simultaneous attack was made in several different quarters of the town. Men emerged from a network of unnoticed tunnels to stab and slash at the city's inhabitants indiscriminately. 14 people were killed. It might be imagined that the effect of the terror would have been to cause us to flee, as the protesters doubtless wanted, but instead we drew closer together and developed an attitude of incandescent contempt for the people who pointlessly attacked us. According to a rumour that circulated among us, the zombies, as we unflatteringly referred to them, were preparing a concentrated attack that aimed to finish us off once and for all. Everyone had a different idea about what form this attack might take, and most of us chose to believe it couldn't happen. We were wrong. It was a bright Tuesday morning, and I was drawing up specifications for the electrical system for a street, when a massive roar emerged from the south. I discovered later that someone had driven a bulldozer through the fences, and a vast crowd was surging through the resulting gap. Jill was at home working on some designs, and as soon as the fastest runners started to swarm around my office, I ran home to make sure she was all right. Behind me, someone threw a Molotov cocktail at a little stone cottage that was intended to become a bakery or butcher's shop. Jill was completely unaware that anything was happening. "They're coming," I told her breathlessly. "They've broken through the fence." "What are we going to do?" she said, paling slightly. "I don't think we're in any immediate danger as long as we don't get caught up in the rioting," I said. "These people aren't terrorists. They're just the usual crowd of zombies. Let's go up to the roof so we can see what's happening. There was a little garden on the roof. From up there we would have a fairly good view of the centre of the town, including the cathedral. When we reached the roof garden we saw a terrible sight unfolding below us. The protesters certainly were not sticking to waving placards. There were fires everywhere, and a vast ugly crowd was congregating around the cathedral. The windows had already been smashed, and it looked like there was the beginnings of a fire behind one of them. We watched breathlessly as the protesters smashed down the door and swarmed in, chanting, "Death to Briggs! Kill the pigs!" in horrible unison. "We need to get out of here," said Jill. I leaned over the edge of our house. Down below, maniacs with hammers, Molotovs, and even machetes surged through the streets, chanting and smashing windows. "We need to blend in," I said, "otherwise they'll rip us to pieces. Let's make placards." We ran into the room on the upper floor where Jill kept her art supplies, and hastily put together 2 placards. One said, "Briggs must face justice," in ugly red capital letters. The other said, "Homes for the poor, not the rich." Jill cleverly painted a hammer and sickle on top of the former, and we added the anarchy symbol, a letter A inside a circle, to the latter. Then we ran back up to the garden where we sat sadly staring at our placards. "I think we should start waving them if they break in," said Jill. "Maybe we could make a Molotov cocktail," I said, "for authenticity. You've got white spirits, haven't you?" "Okay, but take that watch off first," said Jill. "Why?" I said, "it only cost me 50 quid. Doesn't matter if it gets damaged." "It looks too nice," she said. "They'll think you're a rich capitalist." At that moment our attention was arrested by the sight of a man emerging onto the scaffolding that still surrounded the great dome of the cathedral. It was none other than Briggs himself. He seemed to be running from some unseen enemy. As we watched, he steadily climbed the ladders leading to the top of the dome. When he was halfway up, 4 other men appeared at the foot of the dome. Then we saw why Briggs was running. One of the men had an improvised flamethrower and was directing tongues of flame towards Briggs' position. The men hurried after him. Eventually, Briggs reached the very top of the dome, where he sat almost facing us, peering downwards. "We've got to help him," said Jill. "What can we do?" I said. "There's nothing we can do." Jill suddenly began shouting at the men and waving her arms, trying to attract their attention. "What are you doing?" I hissed. "You'll get us killed." "Distracting them," she said. "We'll tell them we've taken over the house of some capitalist pigs." But the men paid us no attention. As they climbed the ladders, the flames of the flamethrower licked ever closer to Briggs' legs. It was clear that he was going to have to take action of some kind. When the flames were almost upon him, he seemed to attempt to rise to his feet on his precarious perch. Then he slipped and went careering down the dome. We saw him fall clean off the edge of the cathedral, and we heard a faint thump as his body hit the ground below. The men cheered. Then we heard the sound of a door splintering. Peering over the edge of the roof, I saw a mob streaming into our front door. We had certainly attracted someone's attention, just not the right people. We could hear people chanting a horrible song somewhere below, something about eating the rich. I looked at Jill and I looked down at my own white shirt and brown chinos. We didn't look like protesters. We looked more like the people the protesters wanted to eat. Again I peered frantically over the edges of the garden, this time looking for a means of escape. There was a drain pipe that led from the roof's gutter down to the ground. There was perhaps a 50% chance that we could climb down it and arrive on the ground in one piece, and a 50% chance that we would die if we tried. "I think we can climb down the drain pipe," I said. "Look." "I can't," said Jill. "You know I can't stand heights." "They'll tear us to pieces," I said. "We've got the placards," said Jill. I made up my mind then and there that I would at least take 1 or 2 of them with me if I had to go. I wouldn't let them take us without a fight. There was a pounding at the door of the little bulkhead that led out onto the roof. The door wasn't strong, and they were bound to smash through it. A gravelly voice emerged from the other side. "We know you. We know who you are, both of you. You're both dead meat." Only then did I notice the drone of an engine. A helicopter was descending steadily towards us. As it got closer, we saw a police logo on the side. The door of the bulkhead abruptly splintered open. Jill and I ran to the far corner of the garden. I was sure these would be our last moments on Earth. But then, a hail of rubber bullets stopped the protesters in their tracks, and they ran back to the stairs, except for one, who fell heavily on the ground, blood streaming from a wound on his head. The helicopter was able to almost land on the roof, and we were saved. We spent the next 6 months living under assumed names in a tent city, queuing up every day for soup and bread. A tall, thick-set man by the name of Irby got us out of there. He had connections of some sort, but I didn't understand exactly what. He had us driven in an army truck to a camp in the middle of the vast landscape of rubble that used to be London. A whole team of people were working there, some of them soldiers with, I was quite relieved to see, machine guns. "Here we will rebuild," said Irby. I looked around at the decaying landscape. It looked like the area had been levelled by bombs, except the fungus sprouted everywhere on pieces of concrete ruin interspersed with fireweed and wild grasses. "Rebuild what?" I said. "Cottages at first," said Irby. "We're having stone and bricks brought in, maybe even a small church. And a monument, of course, to Briggs." You know, I always thought London was ugly anyway. In a funny sort of way, the fungus did us a favour. Thank you for listening. What do you think? Did the protesters have a point, or were they just mindless hooligans? If you enjoyed this story, please consider giving the video a like, and I'll be back next week on Monday, probably, with a story about some tunnels underneath a church that happen to conceal a horrific secret. I'm also considering reading some stories by H.P. Lovecraft which are out of copyright now, they're public domain, but they contain so many words that could now be considered offensive that I'm not sure YouTube will like me if I read those stories, which I think is a terrible shame and a reflection on modern times, since that's classic literature. But anyway, I'm considering it. You've been listening to Science Horror. My name's John. Do join me next time, and until then, sleep well.